Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for today's PENTalk. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them through the question box. We'll answer as many questions at the end as time allows, but if we don't get to your question today, we will follow up with you afterwards. Tomorrow, you will receive an email with a link to replay today's broadcast. So let's get started. Hosting today is Kate Blake, Instructional Designer and Technology Trainer at Pentegra. Kate has been with us since the beginning of her career, where she started in the retirement benefits field. Kate is going to provide us an overview of designing best practices to stay up to date on retirement plan amendments. Kate, I will now hand things over to you.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much, Lizzie, and thank you everybody for taking the time out of your schedules to join us today for what I think is a very exciting and interesting topic. You may not feel that way right now, but I hope over the next 30 minutes to convince you otherwise, because understanding plan amendments, their importance, really can help us add so much value to plan sponsors and employers' lives. So today I'd like to cover three main topics. Number one, what are plan amendments and how do they work? There are two types of amendments, both discretionary and required or interim amendments. I want to talk a little bit about timing, and then that will segue into a discussion about administrative best practices. So that's a lot to cover. Why don't we go ahead and dive right in with a look at what plan amendments are. Now, you might think you know what plan amendments are, and you probably do. It's a change to a retirement plan. But I want to dive into a little bit more detail. Let's start out with just the details of what is a discretionary amendment versus what is a required amendment. A discretionary amendment is a voluntary change to a plan document that is not required. Discretionary amendments, generally speaking, can be adopted any time, although there are generally notice and service provider standards that may apply. Required or interim amendments are necessary to keep a written plan document current, and that can be for things like law changes, court cases, things like that occur between remedial amendment cycles. This can include things like Secure and Secure 2.0 amendments. Let's talk in a little bit more detail now about these two different types of amendments. So our discretionary amendments are where we can add value from the perspective of informing employers and plan sponsors about best practices in plan design. We can talk to employers about, industry-specific data. What are other employers doing in their industry? What sort of plan experiences are they having? We can talk to employers about their own specific demographics of their employees and dive into their own employee needs to help employers craft a plan that works for them and their employees. Things like that include an analysis of the different age bands of employees, the different contribution level that those different age bands, maybe looking at them in terms of service bands and things of that nature, all give us a good view into how we can design a plan that works for everybody involved. And here are some examples. So discretionary amendments can include things like changes to plan eligibility, employer contributions, vesting, and distributions. And I've encountered these all in my career. It may be that you've recently started working with a new plan, and maybe you're just getting familiar with their demographic and business needs and are recommending changes to kind of bring their plan up to current standards and what they currently need. Maybe it's a plan that you've been working with for a long time, but maybe their needs have suddenly changed for some reason. Maybe they did an acquisition, maybe they sold off a piece of their business, or maybe they are expanding into a new line of business. All of those could potentially result in a need for a plan amendment. So when it comes to eligibility, the acquisition is a great example there. If you have one set of employees becoming eligible for a plan at one time and another becoming eligible for another time, that's a great opportunity to bring those eligibility standards in line with each other. Employer contributions. If your business needs have changed, maybe your budget has changed or your clients' budgets have changed for better or worse, you can increase or reduce or change the type of employer contribution to suit their needs. It doesn't have to be, as we all know, it doesn't have to be set in stone from year to year. I've seen vesting changes too, and it's not just vesting schedule changes. I've seen employers change the type of vesting calculation that's performed, whether it be counting hours, 1,000 hours of service, 1,000 hours of service required for a year of service, or elapsed time, where we just simply count from date of hire to date of termination. And different demographics have different needs and different desires for those plan designs. Things like adding different distribution options that a plan may not have previously had increase employee flexibility. But, we don't just want to be willy-nilly adding discretionary amendments to a plan, every year, every time we talk to a plan. We want to be strategic about it. And that's where it can potentially kind of work hand in hand with the other amendment types, which are our required or interim amendments. So our required amendments, as we mentioned earlier, are the amendments that we need to make to the plan for rule changes and things of that nature. Where the discretionary amendments, we get to decide what we're amending the plan to and, why and when. With the required amendments, we have less flexibility. The IRS publishes required amendment lists, which are what I'm showing you right here, each year. And they assign a deadline by which all of the amendments on the list need to be adopted by the plan. There are actually no entries on the 2022 required amendments list, but 2021 does have several entries, and the deadline for those is at the end of this year, so 12/31/2023. So we've actually got a lot of things happening here that may be present in a plan document. We've got any voluntary amendments that occurred along the way. We've got required amendment lists that are published each year that also have a deadline. And then we've got the restatement, which is the last thing that I've listed down here. I said these will be incorporated into the plan document during the next restatement. So what happens is, as I'm sure you all know, every time you amend a plan, it gets attached to the document as an amendment. And typically I see them done in chronological order. So let's say we do a voluntary amendment, that's Amendment 1. Then there's some required amendments, maybe that's Amendment 2. But we don't just go on into perpetuity. We restate the plan on a periodic basis to bring those amendments into the overall document. And at that point, we then start fresh with a new Amendment 1, 2, 3, etc. after the next restatement. The restatement schedules are defined, and the amendments that need to be, sort of think of it as sweeping it into the overall governing document. The amendments that need to be swept into the document are defined as well. So we've got a lot of opportunities for making changes to the plan, both on a voluntary basis, a required basis, and then during each restatement period. Some things to keep in mind when we're thinking about these different types of amendments. Number one, operational compliance. And that's one reason why I suggested we don't necessarily want to be amending the plan willy-nilly every single year. If we amend the plan this year for an eligibility change and then next year for a vesting schedule change, while it does look like as service providers we're providing value to a plan, we're also creating a lot of work for plan sponsors and plan administrators and record keepers to keep that plan in compliance. So when you're thinking about amending a plan, something that I like to do when I used to be client-facing was to group all of my plan design changes together at once. That gives the employer and anybody else who's involved in the operation of the plan, a better chance at remaining in compliance. That way they're not dealing with, a number of different effective dates. Speaking of which, how do we kind of bundle all of this together and present all of these moving parts in a way that makes sense to our clients? I like to use any sort of annual plan review as an opportunity for doing that. I think most of us use the annual plan review already as an opportunity to look at plan provisions. But I think it's also a good opportunity to discuss the status of the document, because as we've seen, the status of the document and any voluntary amendments that we make tie into each other. So one thing that I used to like to do is during my plan review, I'd discuss the plan provisions, then I'd discuss the document, and I'd say, this is when you last restated, this is when your next document restatement is coming up, or likely coming up if the IRS hasn't released the schedule yet. And then we can kind of talk about it. If somebody wants to make changes, does it make sense to make all the changes at once in conjunction with the plan restatement? That way there's many fewer amendments and documents to track, and everything is much more streamlined. So again, not only understanding the provisions and the amendment process, but understanding how it fits into the restatement process and using the plan review as an opportunity to explain that to our clients really ties everything into a nice little package for them. Because what I've kind of found is clients they understand that they want their plan document and they want their plan operation to meet the needs of their employees. Obviously, that's why they're offering a plan. But they may not really understand how it ties in with the restatement and the required amendments and things like that. And what I've seen is if clients don't have an eye for when their restatement is coming down the pipeline and they don't have an eye on those required amendments, they'll just proceed making voluntary amendments, as needed. And it can become a lot, again, just from an administrative perspective. And then when the restatement comes down the pipeline, all of a sudden clients can be left feeling overwhelmed and thinking, well, didn't I just make changes to the plan? What's going on? And things like that. So make sure they understand that required amendments exist. Make sure they understand the required amendments list, and then how that all ties together when we draw everything into the main plan document when we restate periodically. Let me show you a case study to kind of tie all of this together. This is a real case study. This is a client that I worked with in the past. I have obviously changed some of the dates just for anonymity purposes, but largely the details remain the same. So this was a client who changed service providers, and at the time of their transition, the document was restated onto our standard document. In 2018, 1 year later, the plan was amended to change the vesting schedule. And we had just restated the document the previous year, so that then became Amendment 1 to the new document. Then they didn't make any changes for a couple more years, and then in 2020, the plan was amended again. This time they made 2 changes: to add a new distribution method and to change the plan's loan provisions, which was Amendment 2. Then in 2022, the plan was restated again. This was required for the IRS Cycle 3 restatement. But they asked me an interesting question during this process, which was, we just migrated to you guys. We just restated our document when we transitioned over to you guys a couple of years ago. Why would we have to go through this IRS restatement again, was their question. And they were a little bit upset that they had to do that because they felt that they had just gotten this new document. So I wanted to show you this case study just to show, how the process works, how the amendments get, cycled into the overall governing document during this restatement period, and pose and answer that question for you, just in case you get it from any of your clients. And the answer is the same regardless of the transition timing. So say, for example, the client transitioned in 2020. Now only 2 years have passed and just a very short time period, and we're still asking them to restate on, the standard schedule. Again, it's an IRS requirement. They have to. So knowing when that restatement is coming down the pipeline and proactively letting your clients know is a good opportunity just for education. And also, maybe had they understood that it was coming down the pipeline, they could have potentially done Amendment 2 during the restatement and kind of bundled everything together just to minimize change and disruption to the plan. And then once the document was restated, then we start fresh. So the next plan amendment will then be labeled as Amendment 1. But it's important to note, another question that came up was, do we still need to retain copies of all, previous documents and amendments? I think we all know here as service providers and retirement plan practitioners, but the answer is yes, absolutely. After a plan has been restated, please make sure your clients know to retain copies of all previous amendments. And I'll give you an example there. I worked with a client who restated their document, discarded a previous plan document, and then questions came up about the structure of the employer contribution. Thankfully, we had a copy of that old amendment and were able to look back to it. But plan documents are something that should never be discarded because employees, for example, could come back and question old benefits. The onus is on us as service providers to retain that information. So even when you start fresh with a newly restated document, you always want to make sure that you keep all of your previous documents available and stored with plan records. Let's take a moment to talk about timing. So with the voluntary amendments, like we said, we can do them more or less anytime. Certain best practices and vendor standards apply, as I mentioned earlier, and I'll show you a sample timeline of some things to think about in just a moment. The required amendments, generally speaking, are the end of the second calendar year following the year in which the list is issued, unless noted otherwise. Sometimes the IRS will kick the can down the road for certain reasons when it comes to amendment timing. And we actually saw this recently with the CARES and SECURE Act. For those who recall, SECURE 1.0, the original version, passed at the end of 2019, and CARES was 2020 legislation in response to COVID. Based on this required amendment timing, we would think that we should have all of our plans amended for that legislation already. But the IRS actually did note otherwise in IRS Notice 2022-23, which delayed the amendment timing deadline for both CARES and SECURE to December 31st of 2025. I just want to come back to our case study for a moment because another question that came up from that client was when they got that restated document, they got it in 2022. And the first thing they said when they got that document was, where's CARES and SECURE? Because as we said, that legislation passed in 2019 and 2020. It's not in this newly restated document. And the reason is because the IRS restatement period is backward looking. So when we restated the document in 2022, it was for the restatement period that ran from August 1st, 2020 through July 31st, 2022. What that means is that these documents, these Cycle 3 documents, didn't take into consideration any changes that happened prior to 2020 or even the end of 2019. The practical implication of that is that this client now has a newly restated Cycle 3 document that they got last summer, but CARES and SECURE are both going to be tacked on to that document as amendments. Later on, 6 years later, whenever cycle 4, the period opens up, that's when Cares and Secure then will be swept into the next document and incorporated, again, with any, future changes tacked on. So it's always kind of a backward-looking process. That's another thing to understand about the restatement process and about how amendments get swept in. It wasn't just that client that I got that question from. That is a common question when employers are going through the restatement process. If you sign a plan document effective as of a certain date, it's natural to assume that it might include all legislative changes up through that date. But with the restatement process, it really doesn't. Sometimes, by the way, clients ask why, and the answer really is because there's kind of a dance between Congress and the IRS. Congress can pass legislation, but it takes the IRS a while to incorporate that legislation into, active practice. And then further, it takes time for document vendors to incorporate the language into the documents. The IRS has to issue model language and things of that nature, and that's all a very time-consuming process. Now, again, with our voluntary amendments, we have more flexibility in terms of time, but you want to make sure that you leave enough lead time before your voluntary amendment effective dates to get everything done that needs to happen. So let me give you an example. Let's say I have a client who wants to change plan eligibility. They want to go from a 12-month waiting period to a 3-month waiting period because they want the plan to be more liberal and more attractive to employees. If they just decided to make that change in, say, October for a 1/1 effective date, they probably won't have enough time to get everything done that they need to. And here's why. Here's a little timeline. Let's actually work from the bottom of the page upward. If we make our change effective in January for a voluntary plan amendment, there are a bunch of things we're going to need to do. First off, we want to educate people. We want employees to understand the change. We don't want to do it too far in advance, though, because if we do, they probably won't remember by the time the change comes around. So I like to do my education pretty close to the timing of the effective date of any amendments to the plan. In this case, maybe in December. Keep in mind that we have an annual notice package that's delivered every year in November. It is always delivered in November because of IRS notice timing. So we want to make sure that any changes are reflected in the notice package if they need to be. If it's, safe harbor plan or things of that nature, that is information that's conveyed in that notice package. We also need time to get the documents signed. So anytime we're amending a plan, it's going to require an amendment or a resolution be drafted, and that's going to need to be signed by the client. We want those documents to be signed no later than October because we, again, need those notices to go out in November. In order to get the documents signed by October, we need to request and obtain the amendments from the document provider. And we need to give them time to do what they need to do to generate them. So figure they should be requested no later than September. But if we're changing, say, eligibility, that's going to impact other things at the employer, budget discussions and things of that nature. Certainly HR and finance and possibly even the board are going to need to be involved at the employer. So thinking again, just backwards in terms of our timing, we probably want to have those discussions done by the end of summer if we're going to get the documents or request the documents in September. Keep in mind, of course, people tend to take vacations in summer. So, we want to make sure that we schedule those meetings as far in advance as we possibly can, which leaves us to beginning discussions about a 1/1 plan amendment, typically in spring or summer. And that's another reason, though, by the way, why I like to do it in conjunction with the annual plan review, because I think most of us typically tend to do our plan reviews in the springtime. That way we can look at calendar year data, full calendar year data from the previous year. So just keep that in mind anytime you're thinking about a voluntary amendment. Even though you do have the flexibility of time, we want to make sure that we build in ample time, not only to give our service providers time to do what they need to do, but also time to give the employer breathing room and time to build in education for our employees. I want to just say one more word about document retention. These are some actual examples that I have encountered in my experience. I mentioned some of them to you already. People I've seen question old matching contributions from old safe harbor plans. I've seen people question their vesting from 20 years ago. I've seen people asking about allocation requirements when they may have terminated on December 29th in, a reduction, and why didn't they get a contribution? And the one we just talked about, definitions of eligibility change. And the funny thing about these is that, you might think you're good. Oh, I changed this. Nobody coming into the plan now is subject to these old provisions. But the thing about these things is a lot of time these questions tend to rear their ugly head when somebody's getting ready to retire, which is what makes the retirement services industry so different from so many other industries that are also subject to document retention requirements. If we're talking about eligibility for a career employee, we could be looking back 30 years, which could be 5 restatements ago. So even if it's not just the last restatement, make sure all the restatements, all the previous documents are kept, including from prior vendors. We cannot stress that message to our employers enough, because, we all live in a digital world. We've all got a lot going on, but it is probably the number one consideration when it comes to plan document management, just retaining those old documents. And then the last thing I'll leave you with are just some thoughts about employee considerations. We all want what's best for our clients. That's why we're here today. But I think as advisors, a lot of us, we have our employers, our employer clients, our plan sponsor clients in mind when we're working. We want to show value because those are the people who are contracting us for a service. But we also want to keep employees in mind who are the participants of a plan. And that's why, again, I think if we can combine amendments together, and as mentioned, even better if we can do it all during a restatement, if possible, I think that has the best outcome for employees. Because I find from talking to employees, too many changes feels confusing. The example that I showed before where they redid the document in 17, 18, 20, and 22 with amendments and restatements, that was too much. Employees were super confused. Too few changes, though, feels like a stagnant plan experience for employees. If we're still working with the same plan that we had, back in 2010 or 2000, that's probably not good either. That's why I love, a major redesign every couple of years. Again, if you can do it with the restatement, even better. That's the most streamlined way to do these things. So to sum up, remember timing matters for both your voluntary amendments, maybe 6 to 9 months before a desired change, and your required amendments where the IRS defines the timing. Remember document retention. And just remember that balance is key when making plan changes, and then delivering that information in terms of employee education. Lizzie, I know we're just about at time, but before we go, are there any questions that came into the chat box that I can address today?
Thank you very much, Kate. We actually currently do not have any questions, but anyone feel free to submit them. And even if we run out of time today, we will definitely reach back out to you tomorrow.
Okay, sounds great. Before we close out, well, it's 2:30 now, but I will say before we close out, if you're unsure about what document your clients are on, please let us know, and we'll be happy to work with you. The vast majority of our clients are on that document that just restated last year, which is why I selected that to use as our example. But we do have a couple of outliers, and we're always here to assist if you have any questions or concerns about the status of any of your clients' documents or amendments. Thanks everybody for joining today, and I hope everybody has a great afternoon.